Hi everyone, and welcome to 929 Chapters. I'm your host, David Z. Moster, PhD and Rabbi, coming to you from Yonkers, New York. Today we're going to be doing an overview of Genesis chapter 2. We're going to break it down into 4 parts. We're going to have a summary and an outline. Then we're going to read some select verses in Hebrew and English. Then I'll give you a comment, some thoughts of mine on the chapter, and then I'll leave you off with a photo. Okay, so let's begin with the summary and outline of Genesis chapter 2. There are 2 main parts to Genesis 2. The first part is really leaving off from where Genesis 1 actually began. Whereas Genesis 1 spoke about the first 6 days of creation, the first 3 verses of Genesis 2 tell us that God rested on the 7th day of creation, and that is the Shabbat, the day of rest. Then in verses 4 to 25, we learn of the story of the day of creation. And I put that day in quotations because it's important. In this chapter, all of creation takes place in one day, whereas in the previous chapter, it actually took 6 days of creation and 1 day of rest. So let's look a little bit deeper into verses 4 to 25, the story of the day of creation. The first part of this section, in verses 4 to 7, we have the creation of the man, Hebrew ha-Adam. Let's read one verse together, verse 7, because it shows you where the name Adam comes from. Vayitzar Adonai Elohim et ha-Adam afar min ha-Adama. And God Yahweh created the man, Adam, out of the dust from the ground, Adama. So the name Adam, man, actually comes from Adama, ground. Vayipach ba'apav nishmat chayim. And he blew into his nostrils the breath of life. Vayihi ha'adam lenefesh chaya. And the man became a living being. So in the second section, verses 8 to 17, we are told about the Garden of Eden and the man's relationship to it. Basically, before man was created, there was no vegetation and there were no animals. So Yahweh creates a garden, the Garden of Eden, which actually had 4 rivers coming from it. The rivers are Pishon, Gihon, the Tigris, and the Euphrates. And in this garden, man is in charge of all the fruit trees. Now there are 2 special fruit trees. One is the tree of life, and the second one is the tree of the knowledge of good and bad. And Yahweh says to man, "You may not eat of the tree of knowledge of good and bad." Then, in verses 18 to 24, we have the creation of animals and the woman. In this passage, man is lonely. He has no one to be with. So Yahweh starts creating animals for him. And even though man names each animal, those animals really aren't a good fit for man. So then finally, Yahweh creates woman from the tselah, the side or the rib of man, and he creates woman next to man, and man is very happy. And finally, verse 25, the last verse, informs us that the man and the woman were living what seems to be a happy life together in the garden, and they were naked, and they didn't even know they were naked. They were totally fine with their nakedness. So those are the key elements of the day of creation, and the key elements of Genesis chapter 2. So for this chapter, the verses I selected are verses 18 to 24, and they tell the story of how and why the first woman was created. Vayomer Adonai Elohim, and God Yahweh said, Lo tov heyot ha'adam levado. It is not good for the man to be by himself. E'eseh lo ezer kenegdo. I will make for him a partner at his side. Vayitzar Adonai Elohim min ha'adama kol chayat hasadeh ve'et kol hof hashamayim. And God Yahweh created from the ground every living animal on the ground and every bird in the sky. Vayaveh el ha'adam, and he brought them to the man. Lirot ma yikrelo, to see what he would call them. V'chol asher yikrelo ha'adam, nefesh chaya hu shemo. And everything that the man named to the living being, that was its name. Vayikra ha'adam shemot l'chol ha'behema v'la'of hashamayim. And man gave names to all of the animals and all the birds of heaven, u'lekol chayat hasadeh, and to all the animals of the field. U'la'adam lo matzah ezer kenegdo. But man could not find a partner at his side. Vayapel Adonai Elohim tardema al ha'adam. And God Yahweh put a deep sleep onto the man. Vayishan, and he slept. Vayikach achat mitzalotav. And he took one of his sides or ribs, vayisgor basar tachtena, and he closed his flesh under it. Vayiven Adonai Elohim et hatzela asher lakach min ha'adam leisha. And God Yahweh built the rib that he took from man into a woman. Vayivieha el ha'adam, and he brought her to the man. Vayomar ha'adam zot hapam etzem me'atzemai ubasar mi basari. And the man said, "This time it is the bone of my bones, the flesh of my flesh. Lezot yikarei isha. This one will be called woman, isha. Kime ish, because from man, ish, lukacha zot. She was taken. This one was taken. Al kain ya'azav ish et aviv ve'et imo. Therefore, a man should leave his father and his mother, v'davak be'ishto, and cling to his wife, v'hayu levasar echad, and the two of them should become as one flesh." So this is really a great story of how the man, Adam, was lonely, and Yahweh created for him a woman from his own flesh. Okay, so that does it for the select verses. Let's move on to the comment for today. So if you've read Genesis chapter 1, and then you come to Genesis chapter 2, you're probably scratching your head and wondering, hey, isn't this a little bit different than the creation story in chapter 1? And in truth, this is actually a second creation account. And there are a lot of differences between the creation account in Genesis chapter 1 and the creation account in Genesis chapter 2 and chapter 3. So let's point out a few of the differences. The first one is the number of days. In Genesis chapter 1, the world is created in 6 days, and then Yahweh rests on the seventh day. But here in chapter 2, it all happens on one single day. The order of creation is also different. In Genesis chapter 1, vegetation is made on the third day, the animals are made at the beginning of the sixth day, and man is made at the end of the sixth day. But in chapter 2, man is created before the vegetation and before the animals. There's another discrepancy with the creation of man and woman. In Genesis chapter 1, we are told that man and women were created together. But in Genesis chapter 2, we see that man was created first, and then Yahweh takes a rib from man and creates woman after him. Some people like to point out that there's even a difference between the nature of Yahweh in the two creation accounts. In the first account, Yahweh creates from a distance, from his word. He doesn't really get too involved. Whereas in the second account, Yahweh is more of a personified human who builds things. He walks around the garden. He builds man from the clay itself. So the nature of Yahweh is more personified in Genesis chapter 2, whereas he's more of a distant cosmic deity in chapter 1. And then one of the final differences between the two creation accounts are the names of Yahweh himself. In Genesis chapter 1, he is only referred to as Elohim, which basically just means God. It could mean any God. Whereas in Genesis chapter 2 and so on, he's referred to as Yahweh Elohim, God Yahweh. It has a specific name. So this last point was especially important in the history of biblical interpretation because in 1753, a doctor named John Ostruk, who was well known for treating syphilis, he wrote a book called Conjectures on the Original Documents that Moses appears to have used in composing the book of Genesis. It was a French book. Now this book, when it came out, was so controversial that he published it anonymously. You see here on the title page, he doesn't put his name. And if you look even a little deeper, this book is published in Brussels, not in France where he lived, because he was afraid that the French authorities would actually put him in jail or even kill him for writing this book, even though he was a devout man. And so what Ostrich saw was that there were two creation accounts, two sources. The first one used the name Elohim, God, and the second one used the name Yahweh Elohim, God Yahweh. So what Ostrich did, and you can see it here in the original text, is he separated the account of Genesis 1 to 2:3 as the source belonging to the Elohim source, and the account from Genesis 2:4 onward as a source belonging to the Yahweh source, Yahweh Elohim. And later on in German scholarship, these would be the first two sources that would later become known as the documentary hypothesis, the idea that there were many sources that came together to form the Pentateuch. For more on this topic, you can see my video about the documentary hypothesis. So before we move on, I just want to point out that there are a number of other creation passages spread throughout the Bible. Many of these are actually found in the book of Psalms, and if you look here, there are passages such as Amos 9:6, which is about the creation of the world, Psalm 146:6, which is about the creation of the world, Psalm 139:13, which is about the creation of man, Psalm 136:4-9, which we'll actually read inside, which is about the creation of the world, and Psalm 104, which is really the longest passage in the Hebrew Bible outside of Genesis that is about the creation of the world. You can find links to all of these chapters on my website in the commentaries below, but let's read Genesis 136:4-9 inside so you get a feel for what other creation accounts sound like in the Bible. So here we're looking at Psalm 136, and in this psalm, after each sentence, there's a refrain, Ki le'olam chasdo, for his kindness is everlasting. So let's read the psalm. La'osei niflaot gedolot levado. For Yahweh is the one who makes great wonders by himself. Ki la'olam chasdo. For his kindness is everlasting. La'osei hashamayim b'tfuna. For the one who creates the sky with wisdom. Ki la'olam chasdo. His kindness is everlasting. L'roka ha'aretz al hamayim. To the one who spreads and makes firm the land on the waters. Ki la'olam chasdo. For his kindness is everlasting. La'osei urim gedolim. To the one who makes the great stars. Ki le'olam chasdo. For his kindness is everlasting. Et hashemesh l'mamshelet bayom. The sun to rule in the day. Ki le'olam chasdo. His kindness is everlasting. Et hayareach v'kochavim l'mamshelot balayla. The moon and the stars to rule at night. Ki le'olam chasdo. Because his kindness is everlasting. So here we just see another brief account in a hymnic form of Yahweh creating the heavens, the earth, the stars, and the moon, and the sun. But yet there are even more creation accounts outside of the Bible. From the ancient Near East, for example, we have from ancient Egypt the Atum creation stories, where the god Atum creates mankind and the world out of, it depends on which text you use, either he sneezes and the creation comes about, or even he masturbates, and that is how creation comes about. Another story written in Akkadian is Enuma Elish, where the god Marduk defeats the goddess Tiamat, slices her in two, and in one half creates the sky, and in the other half he creates the ground. And then what he does is he creates man to work on behalf of the gods, so the gods can kind of relax and let man take over for them. And then there are other accounts such as the Eridu Genesis, which talk about creation and even things like a flood, and so on and so forth. And so there are many, many other passages about creation in the ancient Near East as well. And if you're interested in these, please check out my video, Studying the Hebrew Bible and the ancient Near East together, where I discuss the Eridu Genesis and compare it with the book of Genesis. Okay, and finally, I'll leave you with a photo. This photo relates to verse 22, where Yahweh creates woman. And the rib that God Yahweh had taken from the man, he made into a woman and brought her to the man. And here we see a chef, kind of like the creator, Yahweh himself, taking the flesh and turning it into a woman. Okay, so that does it for Genesis chapter 2. If you have any questions or comments, please make sure to leave them in the comments section below. Be sure to follow me on Twitter. Check out my website, 929chapters.com, for much more information about this chapter, and I'll be posting this picture on Instagram as well. Thanks for watching, and I look forward to seeing you for Genesis chapter 3.